Jeff Stearns, connected through cars. If they're bigwigs, we'll have them on the show. And yes, we'll talk about cars and everything else. Here he is now, Jeff Stearns.
Let's take this as a little bit of a background, okay? Vince and I were hired up the same day at General Motors. He did a lot more before he came to GM, and he'll tell you about that. He was my boss for 6 months, and I keep on telling him that, and that's kind of hard to believe because in that 6 months, I learned quite a bit. And I continue to learn by reading his books and the articles that he does. Two of the things that I continue to use today was his original teaching to me of a concept called Lancaster's Law, which is a theorem which says the person that brings the most artillery and men to the battle at the point of contact will typically be the victor. And I have used that to explain the Japanese presence on each of the coasts as their entry strategy in a number of pieces that I've done. I have used that theory to explain Kessler's dominance on the West Coast and why they don't do so good in Minnesota. And I've used that in gambling, where I've come to learn that the person with the most money at the beginning of the game typically is the one with the most money at the end of the game. So that has applicability for autos and gambling. But I also learned about the difference between good decisions and good outcomes. And that the best way to ensure a high chance of good outcomes is to go through a process to make good decisions. Not the boss wants this, and it's the favorite topic of the boss's wife, and so we have to do this. There's a whole bunch of stuff that Vince will explain, and I have really used that in a lot of my consulting with suppliers. And then finally, one of the most he lives in a lovely community of Capitola. It is a beautiful place, and the last time I was there, Vince and I took a ride out to see a navigation firm which General Motors was thinking about buying, and it was 1985. Yeah, San Francisco based. Company was called ETAC. And we took a car from San Francisco to Capitola following ETAC's instructions on how to get there. And we wound up in his backyard of his soon to be or future to be house that was going to be built. Okay. So look, he has, if a sergeant has 3 stripes on his sleeve, Vince would fill all the sleeve on both sides. Okay. He's not a doctor. Okay. And the reason for that is he didn't have time because he actually did the stuff. And he doesn't remember this, but he always enjoyed going back to Harvard and all of these other high educational institutions, because it was always good to go back and explain to those people that would never have him as a student what the real world was like. So with that introduction, and I respect him, like I said, I only worked for him for 6 months. He was always on my mind inside of GM whenever I had to do stuff that required a little more than just surface thinking. And so with that, I turn it over to Vince Barabba.
Vince, great to have you on Jeff Stearns Connected Through Cars.
Nice to be here.
A distinguished career in understanding what customers want and ensuring that management understands the implications prior to spending serious money. Now, it's clear that you understand that. But what kind of experience do you have with General Motors applying that?
Well, it took a while because General Motors was in a position in the market that if they made a minor mistake, it really wouldn't show up too bad. If you made a major mistake, it showed up, but there was such resources in the enterprise that things would just kind of say, well, we shouldn't do that again, kind of thing. But as competition got a little more difficult, it became clear that we were not going to be in a position to make those kind of mistakes, because you make a mistake early in the development process of a vehicle, it takes a long time to find out how bad the mistake was. And so you got to fix that thing early.
Got it. Now, and your background is also Xerox, Kodak, and of course, General Motors.
Yeah. And an agency called the United States Census Bureau.
Excellent. Now, I'm sure you were born with all these philosophies and you were just a child prodigy. But along with that, I'm sure you've had some things happen to you along the way, or some bosses and mentors along the way that help instill in what you later were able to crystallize with this decision making. Am I right?
Well, really the essence is when I graduated from college, I was hooked up with a very strong political campaign management firm. And they turned me loose in providing information to political campaigns. The important part of that was it all happens very fast. So you, in essence, get information, you provide it, it's either used or not used, and you quickly see the result. So when you do this across the country, as I did in campaigns all across the country, from congressional to assembly to state senate and a presidential campaign, you learn a lot in a hurry. And you see the results of the decision process that you were using, and you find its strengths as well as its limitations. And I would say it was that background in the political activity that gave me insight into how to improve decision making.
Got it. And I'm looking at my notes. You started understanding consumers by understanding voters.
Well, you had to find out what a consumer was expecting to do. And if it was the right decision, you reinforced it. If he was expecting to make a decision that your team didn't want, you had to find out what information would change that person's mind and then provide that information. Or you would find out there was nothing you were going to say that was going to change that person's mind, so you didn't use any resources to try to change something that was not going to change. And so it was a way of identifying what you could do to cause the right decision.
You sound so objective about it. You sound so removed from the outcome.
No, you couldn't be removed because you had to get inside of it, and you had to understand the decision makers as well as the people that they were attempting to impact. And that was where the learning took place, because you had to translate to each other what was going on. So you could not be removed. You had to be involved in the activity.
Okay, so when I say removed, I'm talking emotionally. You're saying, like, listen, if there's some piece of information that'll change that decision maker's mind, if it's accurate, of course, we need to provide it. If they're not going to change their mind either way, we don't need to spend any time on the analysis or coming up with the data. So you're kind of like this fork or that fork. Were you ever attached to the outcome emotionally?
Well, in the case of Ronald Reagan, his gubernatorial campaign, we got deeply involved in that and got to know him and his family. And so I was kind of deeply involved emotionally in that campaign. Also, I would say that my first campaign with Don Regal, who was running for Congress in Michigan, not only did I get engaged with him, but the team that was supporting him, a fellow named Bob Breeden, who was running the Buick Motor Car Division in Flint, which paid off for me later, and others, you became friends, and we communicated, throughout my whole career. Of course, I'm getting old enough now that not a lot of them are left.
What was it, going back to Reagan? What were some of the things about getting involved? So you were objective. Little by little, you got, I don't want to say less objective, but you got more emotionally involved. You cared about the outcome. You cared about the outcome because you got to know the Reagan family. So, of course, I can only know him as a politician, or only know him because of the news, or because of one of his speeches. And I'm a Reagan fan, don't get me wrong, but I don't know Ronald Reagan. So you were involved with his family. What was it about him and his family that moved you towards wanting him to win or prevail?
Well, I think one little episode probably tells the story. For most candidates, we had decided what they should say. And so we had prepared a speech for him and presented it. And he said, I don't want to say that. He says, I'll write my own speech because I know what I want to say. That was the first time that happened in any campaign I was involved in. And that told me a lot about the personal integrity of the individual. He didn't want to say what he was going to be helpful to him. He wanted to say what he knew to be true and what he wanted to do. That was a really important insight to me.
I'm happy to hear that about Ronald Reagan, because I wasn't ready to get my fantasy crushed about what a great guy I thought he was. So I'm happy to hear that. Now, Nancy was the driver, is that right?
She was very influential, yes.
Yep, she knew what she wanted. Now, until 2003, you were GM of corporate strategy and knowledge development at General Motors. And you also, did you conceive OnStar?
No. There were a lot of very creative people inside of GM, and they were always working on things. The problem is that to get something done in a vehicle requires the engineering organization to accept the concept. And to install OnStar was going to really have a big impact on the engineering of the vehicle. And the thing that was kind of interesting is that we laid it out to the engineering organization one day, the importance of what OnStar meant relative to making revenue on the vehicle after it was sold. And one engineer said, oh, I get it. We're going to put a cash register in the car, and every time somebody uses that service, the money comes back to GM. I said, I wish I would have thought of that, but that's exactly what it is.
And because of the subscriptive services or whatever a la carte item they might need.
Again, another aspect of it was GM was able to monitor aspects of the vehicle while it was being used, and they would learn things about how the fuel consumption was and things of that nature. So in essence, it was really a way of keeping in touch, not just with the customer, but with the product that you provided the customer and how that product was actually performing.
Well, and looking back, Vince, OnStar was really quite an undertaking. It was really quite a feature. I was a General Motors dealer at the time. And I mean, if nowadays with everything built into your cell phone and more microprocessing than a 747 in your phone, it would be obviously an easier undertaking. There's a million apps that'll do all of that stuff. But OnStar at the time was a analog mobile phone, big handset thing in the center console of, in my case, I'm remembering like Cadillac Catera days. Okay. Sorry, folks. Sorry to lose half my audience. Cadillac Catera. That, of course, had to use navigation, etc. But if I recall, couldn't OnStar get involved in like a stolen vehicle situation, both from a locating?
Oh, yeah. No, actually, it was used that way. And also, as an example, there was a car was in a crash, which was recorded at the OnStar offices. So they called the police to go to that location. The police arrived at the location and said, "There's no vehicle here. There's no evidence of a crash." And the OnStar operator said, "They're definitely there." And he said, "No, they're not." He says, the OnStar operator said, "Would you wait just a second?" She went in, accessed the vehicle, and honked the horn. And they heard the horn. They looked over the ridge, and the vehicle was on a railroad track down below. And there were 3 people, 1 already dead, but 2 alive. And there was a train about to arrive. And so they were able to stop the train and save the 2 people. Now, when we talked about OnStar, we never had that in mind. But it was those kinds of incidences that really identified the value beyond the original concept. It actually saved lives. And that was, in my mind, that was, when that happened, I just said, wow, am I glad we pulled that one off.
Well, so I remember that. So, of course, if you couldn't find your car, they could honk your horn. Now, this was used for, thank God, a life-saving situation. Of course, location services. But couldn't they also, like if cops were chasing a stolen car, couldn't they slow it down or apply the brakes or make it pull to the right? Or am I in fantasy land?
You know, I'm not 100% sure, but I think things like that actually occurred. But I don't know the specifics of any particular case, but I kind of have a recollection of that, yes.
Yeah, I mean, that's really genius for the technology that was available. Now, I'm going to put in the notes on YouTube. I'm looking at my notes, the publications that you've authored or co-authored, tons of books and articles. So I'm going to put that for the listener down in the notes. And, Warren says, our good friend that introduced us, that this will be a master class in decision making. So my first note says, joining GM, the desire to bring the voice of the consumer into the company and improve the decision capability of the top management. And then you got a Bob O'Connell and Jim Smale story.
Well, when I was working at Kodak, there was a big issue relative to moving from silver halide technology to using electronics to capture images and make prints. And you can only imagine that the scientists in the Kodak research labs who knew more about silver halide than any other place in the world, and they were kept fundamentally in a secret area. They had no desire to talk about moving to a silver electronic camera. So I was asked to give a talk to the board of directors, of which John Smale was on the board. And I pointed out the likelihood that the electronic technology would over the next decade, start having an impact on the business, and that we really had 10 years to prepare for using a different form of image capture and presentation. And it was an interesting presentation to the board, but I think members of the board understood it better than some of the senior executives at Kodak who were really silver halide people. And but that did cause them to start thinking about it. When I was contacted by GM, and it was interesting that I believe it was Smale who arranged for me to give a talk at GM because he was on the board of GM as well. So I went and gave fundamentally the same presentation about how to start thinking about the future and move from what you're currently doing to what you need to do. And so I went to GM and I gave that presentation, and it fairly well received. In fact, John Smith, who eventually became the chairman, was in the room at the time. So when I got there, I was a little bit nervous about coming into a place and not knowing anybody or anything. So I went to a fellow by the name of Bob O'Connell, who was in charge of planning. And I said, I really need to talk to different people. And he said, well, I've arranged for you to visit everybody that I think would be relevant, which I then went on a day-long series of meetings with different people. And I came back to him and I started pointing out the questions that were raised while I was there. He said, I know those are the questions, but you don't know what the result is. They all said, hire you. And at that point, I knew it was that's where I wanted to go.
Nice. So this is what you're famous for. This is what our mutual friend Warren, what you're famous for to me, brings up a lot is about your decision making and good decisions versus good outcomes. They're often isolated, unrelated, and shouldn't go that way. And what can happen is good decisions, good outcomes, good decisions, good outcomes, and then a good decision with a bad outcome. Can you expand on that?
Well, all of those things happen, by the way, but the key element in improving the decision-making process is to record the process. Now, most of the time, at least at that time when I got started, a decision was made and it was implemented, and then it either was successful or it wasn't. But if it was, nobody went back and found out what about the decision led to its success. And more importantly, they never went back and looked at the underlying assumptions that proved not to be correct. So that led me to come to a belief that in addition to making the decision, it needs to be recorded in such a manner so that you could learn from the decision that you made, not just that you benefit by the decision that you made, but you learn as an enterprise what is working and what is not working. And once that hit home to me, that's when I started working on designing systems that required that you list the assumptions you made to make this decision, including assumptions that were questionable, that you identified as questionable. And then after the decision was made, even though the decision may have moved on to another assignment or wherever, the record was there. And there was a group of people within our organization who were constantly checking the underlying assumptions. And if an assumption didn't turn out the way it was expected to, we were then able to identify that. And then if you have the records of all the assumptions that are part of all the decisions, if a major assumption changes, you can go all back to all the decisions which that assumption had an effect on and say you should be aware that something is different and be prepared for some change. That was the essence of my learning.
Can you give an example of an assumption? Is it like we know all consumers want X? Or I'm sorry, we assume the assumption is all consumers want X?
Well, you go and you do a study, okay? And you question people about what they want and what they don't want and how they feel about things. And then that becomes, some people believe to be a fact. I say it's an assumption because you're talking to a sample of the population at a point in time, and it's not, there forever. So you have to list it as an assumption, not a fact, and then constantly review the assumption. And that's the hard part of in a large corporation, to say that something that everybody thought is a fact will be questioned later. And in the case of the automotive industry, that was very, very true.
Sure, a sample. So I love that. A sample of people at one point in time. That's a moving target. So what makes a good decision?
Well, a good decision takes into consideration what the expected outcome is, and then lists the assumptions that have to be made to create that outcome, and then to measure as best you can what the extent to which those assumptions are true. So it's not about should we do this or do that. We have to find out why should we do this and why should we do that, and understand those underlying assumptions, and then constantly monitor changes happening. Now, when I started in this area, back in the 70s and 80s, things were not changing very much in society. Today, what is a fact yesterday is no longer a fact tomorrow, because things are changing so fast. So it's very important that you're constantly monitoring the changes that are taking place in society and what effect those changes have on an existing decision and on future decisions as well.
So I assume that it's important to make good decisions by your definition of what a good decision is, and sometimes good decisions have bad outcomes.
Yes.
I'm trying to think of a ratio. I mean, it makes sense to me that a hand played right every time by the rules with using the big numbers would prevail. But do you have any data that points to the good outcome against a bad decision, the good outcome against a good decision, to support that a good decision needs to be made?
Following World War II, GM's factories were making, military equipment. And so therefore, after the war, since there were no new cars during the war, there was an incredible increase in the demand for vehicles. And based on that increase, GM put a lot of resources into reestablishing their factories and producing an awful lot of vehicles. And that was good for several years. But once the marketplace had the new vehicles in, people were no longer looking for any vehicle. They wanted now their kind of vehicle. And so because they were successful in what they were selling, they put aside a lot of the market research, which, by the way, at GM actually started back in 1930 with a fellow named Buck Weaver who actually started market research. And they ignored all that for a period of time, which led to its eventual decline. So that was, I would call, a bad decision that led to a bad outcome for that period of time.
Got it. So, you're obviously sold on the concept, and it's not a hard one for me to accept. I was just wondering, since you had teams measuring everything, if the decision made the right way, to your parameters, without getting into that again, versus the wrong way, if the outcome was a good outcome twice as often, 10 times as often? Like, was it no contest?
Well, another example comes to mind is in the 70s, in the late 70s, they made a decision driven by the accounting department to reduce the cost of development. And one of the ways to do that was to use a basic platform and make the vehicles slightly different, but that no matter what you did, they were off the same platform. So there were 4 brands that were basically on the same platform. Interestingly, Fortune magazine, I think it was in '83, had a cover of the 4 vehicles all lined up, and you could not tell the difference from the angle in which they took the pictures. And those vehicles did not sell well because they were not reaching what specific customers wanted. So it was an economic decision to reduce costs that had a significant impact on the revenue side.
But did they test it?
No, because everybody knew that they were going to reduce the costs. That was the driving force.
Okay, but I didn't know if it had checked the good decision boxes along with.
That was done before I was there.
Okay.
And my guess is that the research, if it was there, it would not have had effect because the pressure was on to reduce costs.
Got it. So automotive companies have always had what's called decision friction, right? Between engineering push and consumer pull. The communication environment leading decisions needs to understand both, right? Can you expand on that?
Well, when I first got there, GM was in the process of redesigning the Camaro and the Firebird, and we were going to go do research on it. And I was contacted by an engineer by the name of Harvey, and Harvey said, "Could I go along and do your research?" And I said, "Well, why would you want to do that?" He said, "Well, I just like to hear what the customers are telling you, and how you present it to us." So we said, "Sure," and so he went along with us, and we were talking about stopping distance. In our case, stopping distance was the length of time it took, the amount of space it took for you to hit the brakes and actually come to a stop. And so Harvey asked me what we had heard, and that's why I talked to him. Well, they looked like this amount of stopping space. He said, "That's not what I heard." I said, "Well, what did you hear?" He said, "They wanted to be in control while they were stopping. And the feel of the brake is what was really going to be important to them." And I said, "Harvey, I don't understand what you're talking about." He said, he says, "I've done a lot of work on how to apply pressure to a braking system. And I would like to go back and see if we could do something." Well, he designed a braking system. I think I've got a copy of an article here that, anyway, it was put into the car. And one of the reviewers of the vehicle from one of the paper in Pennsylvania pointed out that he was absolutely amazed at how effective the braking system was. Not that it stopped in time, but that he was in control while the vehicle was stopping. And he ran an article about that in the local paper. And it just was such a good example of how somebody listened. And because of his experience as an engineer, he heard something that a market researcher wouldn't understand. And that's when it became very clear to me that we had to design a system that engaged the engineers and the researchers, the scientists, so that they really heard what was going on rather than our interpretation of what we heard.
Great case. Thanks for sharing that. Now, what about the value of information collected from the consumer being in its use?
Well, if you are going out and you're doing research, and then you find out that consumers want something, and somebody in a financial organization said, "That's going to cost too much, and we will never be able to make any money on it." So then you got to get everybody together. And you have to say, "I understand what the finance guy said. Now, in the engineering department, is there a way to which we could get this done with less expense?" And that's where, when you create that dialogue, and the engineers sit down, and instead of designing the most ultimate of all designs, they say, "Oh, we could drop that, and it would not have a lot of effect on the quality of this performance." And so in that dialogue that took place between what the customer wanted, what we could afford to provide, and what we could do with the resources that were available so that we could still make a profit, that led to really much better discussions.
Got it. So what about tracking decisions and results, like having to face reality?
Well, that's the hard part because normally in most companies, when somebody makes a decision, by the time the outcome hits, that person's moved on to another job or been promoted or whatever. And that's why having a decision record in which the decision is made and all the assumptions were made to it is an important document, because you can go back and say, "Hey, why didn't this product do as well as we thought?" And when you do that analysis, you check those assumptions and you say, oh, that assumption we made about how people feel about braking systems? That's not what they were actually hitting. They were talking about something that we didn't do. In this case, we did it, but that would be an example. And so maintaining a record of consumer information broken down by very important assumptions that led to a decision is really the important thing to do. And to keep that record and available in a way that people can access it based on products they're developing that might be close to what you've already done.
Interesting. What about the best inputs, research provided to GM management on like OnStar and full-size pickup responding to RAM?
Well, that was an interesting one because GM was in a very tight spot economically. At the time, it was time to redo the trucks. And we did an analysis of the market, and it was clear that the demand for trucks, including SUVs, was increasing, and that what the RAM was doing was reaching some of those customers. So as they were developing the CK truck platform, we did a large research study, and we presented the vehicle in different forms, from very small cabins, which were not expensive and worked very well, to much larger cabins, which were much more comfortable for everybody and had a lot of utility, because we found out that most people originally always thought that a truck was something that a person drove, and it was only that person in the vehicle. As we were doing our research, it was clear that a person driving the truck always had people with him. And if the vehicle was uncomfortable, then he was having a hard time getting him to come along. And so we did that study, and it became clear that the vehicle that we were going to develop was more likely to not do well because it was going to be a single person vehicle. So we designed the trucks that ended up coming into with a third door, so people can get in and out without any moving a lot of people around. And that program went very, very well. It was very successful.
I remember that third door. What about what inputs that research provided for OnStar?
Well, OnStar really was much more of an idea that we felt needed to be presented, because it was hard to describe it in a way that a customer could tell you whether they liked it or not. You had to actually demonstrate it, and a person had to feel it and go through it to really appreciate the fact that they'd be willing to spend more money to get that kind of capability in their vehicle. So we did research pretty much after it was decided we were going to do it, as to how to present it, based on the experience we had in having people actually drive it. And so that research was really more how to present it rather than whether we should do it.
Got it. And then what about at Kodak, like digital versus silver halide?
Well, that was a tough one because there wasn't a lot of ways to demonstrate the difference at the early, when I was there at least, and because I left there in '83, I believe. And but in talking to the people in the research labs who were working on the digital, we were able to identify what the advantages might be. Like, for example, not having to buy film and constantly replacing the film pack. And then to what extent would watching an outcome on a television screen be versus a hand holding a picture in your hand, although you could do both. So we did a lot of research on whether people would foresee that as being valuable. At the beginning, it sounded like it might be, but it wasn't very clear. And so we continued to do research, and when it became clear that what they were doing was really breaking through to a whole new concept that could only be valued by its actual use. That's when they decided to go with the digital. And it was interesting because it also applied to other kinds of photography, like with X-rays and things of that nature, because the doctors found it to be much more efficient than having to take a picture and then wait for everybody to develop it and that kind of stuff. So, because of the nature of the end product, it was very difficult to do research, but it was done, and it indicated there would be a benefit, and so a decision had to be made as to whether to take that chance.
So what was the level of concern on losing the ongoing sales of film?
Well, it was more of a concern with the distribution network than it was with Kodak, because Kodak was going to get the money by these cameras. But we were going to put a lot of people out of business. And that was a big concern with management who grew up with these people. But the question was, if we don't do it, what if somebody else does? And it was clear that particularly the camera makers in the Orient were going to go down that path. So the decision was made, we'll have to do it.
Now, your latest book, A Systems Thinking Decision-Making Process. So what are your key takeaways for automotive professionals making decisions?
The key takeaway, as I discussed earlier, is making sure there's a process to identify and make absolutely clear the underlying assumptions. But as importantly is after the decision is made, instead of just looking at the outcome, find out what led to the outcome by going back and checking which of those decisions held up and which of those decisions didn't. Now, the reason that becomes a problem for some people or some companies is nobody wants to write down everything about a decision. Because, now you're holding me accountable. Well, it's about time they get held accountable. And what this document this book does, it talks about the history of my involvement in decision and what led me to realize that although I spent a lot of time improving the decision-making process, I didn't spend any time learning from the decisions. So this book points out that not only do you make the decisions, but you should have a process in place so that you learn from the decision that you made. And that's not done very much because the way most companies are organized, people are moving on all the time, and nobody likes to write down everything that happened. But I think it's an important thing to do because in today's world, things are changing so fast that what was a reasonable assumption yesterday may not be a reasonable assumption tomorrow.
Interesting. So what do you mean by how to avoid burnt toast?
Yeah, well, I have to rely on Edwards Deming on that because that's the first time I ran into it. And just find a paper I think I got. He, by the way, was a really interesting person. Where the heck is that there? Well, fundamentally what he said is that burnt toast is what happens when you don't have all the facts of the decision right. And you go ahead and do it. And instead of golden brown toast, you end up with burnt toast. And then you take the burnt toast and you scrape off the bad part. And then you have toast that's acceptable. And Deming's point was you should be doing a lot of stuff to understand the effect of the decision and what things you are doing that affect the decision so that you avoid burning the toast. So it's really more about avoiding burnt toast is having a decision process that lessens the chance of making a mistake.
Interesting.
And Deming, by the way, was one of those really major contributors to the well-being of understanding how to do things. I never met him while he was at the Census Bureau, but as I was at the Bureau, he came in a couple of times and we had nice chats. And then he came and visited us when I was at GM as well. And he was one of the most interesting people I've ever met.
No kidding. Now, this is by memory, not from my notes, but weren't you in a meeting in GM, like down in the bowels in the basement when the shuttle blew up? Or do I have that messed up?
No, we were, Dick Worthland, who was my partner when we formed our market research company, was called, it started out with datamatics and it became decision-making information. And after a while, that's when I did all the political campaigns, but in mid-70s, I went to the Census Bureau and Dick kept the company going. And so we were going to do some research, and I invited Dick in to talk to our group about how we might go about doing it. And he was in the process of talking about some of the things that he was looked into when the phone rang. And somebody picked it up and said, "Mr. Worthland, this is the White House calling." And we all were aghast. And Dick got on the phone, and he found out that the shuttle had exploded and that President Reagan wanted him to come to Washington and help prepare his statement about that accident. So Dick thanked us for his taking time. He left the meeting, flew off to Washington, and prepared the president's speech. It was such a sad moment for to have that whole thing happen. It was also kind of interesting to be in the room when somebody who you knew, for your whole career was being asked by the president to go do something. And Warren, I think, would identify that everybody in the room was really held back by that one.
Well, I'm most proud that I was able to recall something from a recorded conversation I had with Warren like over a year ago. So what do you think of that, Warren? So, Vince, what is something we'd be surprised to know about you?
I'm a woodworker. Woodworking is my hobby.
Okay.
And I love it because once I get there, I forget everything else.
So you're really able to get in the moment while you're doing your woodworking.
Oh, yeah. Hold on just a second.
What a sweetheart.
When you're doing this, you don't want to think about anything else. So that's my candle holder.
That must have been really hard to find a stick twisted around like that for you to polish up.
Yeah, you're right. I think everybody needs something to take them away from their day-to-day stuff. And to me, woodworking is one of those things. And because you have to involve yourself because it's, first of all, you got to pay attention because it could be dangerous when all that power equipment. And I was the beneficiary of acquiring some ancient sequoia wood from a tree that fell down in the sequoia forest in 700 BC. And so I've got this incredibly beautiful wood that keeps me busy as well.
Wow. 700 BC.
Yeah. You look at the grain, it's so tight. You can hardly barely see the grain. It's so tight.
And it's not petrified? I mean, it's not like a rock?
No, it fell just in 73. And so it was cut. And then it was cut up into blocks and so it could dry. And but when it's finished, it's one of the strongest and the second lightest wood out there. It's almost like it's a very light wood. And so you could do all kinds of things with it because you carve it, do whatever you want. And it keeps me busy.
Now, what would you want us to know about you?
It's interesting. I was born in Chicago. My father was an Italian immigrant, and my mother's parents were Italian immigrants. and my father was a laborer. And but we had and I have an elder brother, a former Marine Corps member, and we were a very tight family. And unfortunately, my father died when he was relatively young, so my mother kind of took over the reins, and she made sure I got through college and things of that nature. And so, and I married a wonderful woman, and we have 2 children. So the family is the thing that I think is something you have to kind of keep in contact with, because it brings back great feelings, great memories, and allows you to want to do more for each other.
Beautiful.
And my wife's an artist, so I get to enjoy that too. In fact, I think you can see that painting back there. That's one of her paintings.
Nice. Now, how far are you from the car week, Pebble? Okay, because I can barely afford the ticket, but I definitely can never afford a hotel, so.
We have a deck that you can sleep on.
There's a half an invite, right, Warren? If I find you sleeping on my deck, I won't call the police.
Okay. It is interesting, that I guess there is one important part. Before I left, we did a major study about the future of the enterprise.
Before you left General Motors?
General Motors, yeah. And one of the things we came up with after we did some studying was that there was much more profits to be made after the car is sold than the actual making and selling of the car, between insurance and financing and all those other things. And we did a study, and it was very clear that what we refer to as downstream revenue was an important concept. And I just find it and by the way, Mary Barra at that time was working with the planning organization. And she's done an incredible job of creating that downstream revenue, whereas GM today is into all kinds of businesses that are related to the vehicle, but it's after the vehicle has been made and sold. And that brings them into an atmosphere of more creativity, because you're doing things that haven't been done before. And it causes them, and because they're a car company, they can say, what if we change the car company? What if we change the car? Could we do more things? And that's what we're starting to see happen. And she should be commended for making sure that has occurred.
Beautiful.
GM was a very engineering push firm. Car guys don't need to listen to stuff. They just were inherently born with it. We know how to make cars. And I would put Vince at the top of the list that not only questioned that assumption, but made them think harder that engineering push and demand pull had a role in the company. And they better start listening. That was no small nut to crack.
It's interesting, too, because at the time I was coming in, Bob Lutz was also coming to GM. And at that point, though, he had a record of understanding the use of consumer research, since it was part of his master's degree at Berkeley. But his idea that an engineer will decide what's going to happen. And it took a lot of dialogue to make sure that we kept the information from the customer flowing into the process.
Bob Lutz was great for consumer pull.
Not quite, but he understood it.
No, he was like, if my gut likes it, that's the product.
Well, we had some interesting conversations.
I don't know if you talked about it, but Vince put the research group inside of the design studio at the building. That's just one indicator of the influence that he had on the organization.
Was that hard to pull off, Vince?
Well, it was interesting when Chuck Jordan was in charge of design. I used to have to get permission to come into the building because I had to get permission because the doors were locked. But then Wayne Cherry came in from Europe to head up design. He called me in one day and he said, "I'd like you to move your office into the design center." And I said, "Sure." And so we did. And then one day he said, I want one of your guys to be an employee of the design center. And he hired one of our, who was it? Can't think of the name right now. Anyway, but that person went in and we learned more about what the designers needed to know to make better decisions. And they had these 20-foot boards, which was where their decision process was. And when he got down there, there was none of our information on the boards. And after several months, he walked down and looked at the boards, which I was allowed to do finally. There was our information was on the boards as well. So I would say that Wayne Cherry did a incredible. He took a lot of heat for doing it, but I think after it was shown what could be done, he got a lot of credit for it as well.
That's interesting.
The final thing that I'll say about character is when Vince was my boss, he gathered up a couple of us and said, "Now I want you to go up to Rochester." I think he called it Ra-Cha-Cha. And I want you to go up to Rochester and go to Kodak. There's a number of things that you folks can learn up there of what we did, so you can be smarter when you come back here. And my indicator of character, remember this was early on when I was his employee. One of the metrics of character was when we went to Kodak, they took us back and showed us everything. The secrets, the stuff, and they said, "Well, if Vince says it's okay, we'll show it to you." He didn't work there anymore, but he installed that sense of character to me in his old organization, and that was a real tell for me that I don't know if I've ever told him.
No, he never did. Thank you.
That was leadership, with or without the title, with or without the position.
You got it. Yeah.
Absolutely.
That's nice. That really is. I'm glad I got to be here for you to hear that, Vince. And Warren took you too damn long to say it.
Well, I got to tell you that there was a lot that needed to be done at GM when I got there, but Warren had already started it. And so therefore my job was more doable, thanks to him.
Okay. Well, I'm going to start crying. So it's very sweet, like no bullshit.
That's the biggest stretch, but I
it's very honest to God. It's very like sincere. It's very sweet. Yeah, I got goosebumps to see the, let's just say it, affection that you guys have for each other, admiration. I love it. So I appreciate it.
This has been Jeff Stearns, Connected Through Cars.